Hi, this is Jim Janossy, and this is the lecture for Chapter 13 of Gombrich's Story of Art. What we're going to be looking at here is, as you read here, Italy in the 15th century. And Gombrich has titled this Tradition and Innovation. This is where we're going to see the application of some of the concepts of perspective and some of the resumption of ancient Roman architecture in Italy in the beginning of the Renaissance. There's, at the back of the book, various charts on around page 660 that give you a timeline and also illustrate the timeline with the names of various artworks as the Wilton diptych, artists like Masaccio, Alberti, Gazzoli, Pollaiuolo, Botticelli, and various others, all the way down to Raphael. So what we're looking at here is really a timeline of the Renaissance, from around 1350 on down to this date, 1492, which just happens to be one that you probably would remember towards the end of the 15th century. So I recommend that you take a look at the back of the textbook and explore this chart as a summary to help you see what's going on in the Renaissance. Here we're taking a look at a very interesting church by an architect named Alberti. The Roman form of a commemorative arch has been adapted by this architect to the facade of a church. Now recall, this is soon after the era of Gothic cathedral building, and this has nothing to do with the appearance of a Gothic cathedral. We have here pilasters that are based on Corinthian columns. Most significantly, we have the curved arch, the round one instead of a pointed one, and it looks sort of like a Greek temple with this sort of a roof, because this is the way a Roman commemorative arch would look. And here's the door, is this entryway, which is the center of the arch. So this is completely different, an adaptation of Roman architecture to the use in a church. Very interesting, very different than what preceded it. Alberti also created this building, which really isn't a church. It was a rather plain building. It's a residence, Palazzo Rucellai. So what is it about this that makes it different? Well, what makes it different is a couple of things. First of all, much like the Colosseum, it's got different orders of columns, but they're not real columns. They're once again pilasters. They're just cosmetic decorations. Notice, although this follows the Gothic era, he's used round arches, not pointed ones. But what are these little things? If you look on the facade of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, definitely a Gothic cathedral, you'll see windows cut out like this. So he's mixing styles here. He's using some elements of ancient architecture, Greek and Roman architecture, mixed with some Gothic decoration here in this building that has nothing to do with the church or any other type of a structure that was probably known in the ancient world. So it's an interesting mixture. What we're going to see in this chapter is, as various concepts and ideas of perspective come in Italy in the Renaissance, there is this mixture of a transition between one era, one style, and another. Now here, Ghiberti, a very famous artist who created doors on the baptistry in Florence. If you compare this door panel in gilt bronze, meaning gold-covered bronze, if you compare this to some of the earlier door panels that we've looked at, that one that I'm thinking of is where Adam and Eve have been found out. God's pointing at Adam, Adam's pointing at Eve, Eve's pointing at the snake. Plain-looking figures against a plain background. Here we have the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist. And in this door panel, we see a lot of things going on that are distinctly fancier. Here's much more of a background, but even more, remember the statue of the Virgin Mary that we saw holding Jesus, and it had this kind of an S-shaped curve to the way the body was standing? Look at this over here, too. This has that very same, every one of these bodies has this kind of a curving, sort of a relaxed position to it. So what we see happening here is getting away from a lot of the stiffness of the Middle Ages. Much more realism creeping in this way. Now, of course, Jesus probably wasn't baptized this way. It probably was a full immersion baptism, so this is kind of illustrating what people thought at the time as child baptisms are done these days. Here we have Brother Angelico, a monk who decorated the monastery with very simple, very interesting frescoes of this variety. And the reason this one is particularly interesting is it would look more like a decoration from the Middle Ages, being very sparse and being focused on the religious aspect, the scene that's pictured here. But it's apparent that Angelico had absolutely no problem with perspective. That is, linear perspective, where these curving parts of the ceiling recede into the distance. If you take a look at this next illustration where I put some perspective lines on, we don't have too much to go on here, but if we take the same height of those arches there, and we take this straight line here that's conveniently provided, and maybe the center line down from here, maybe the center line down from here because that's where these arches intersect, and we can imagine where the corner is here behind Mary. If we extend all those lines, we find that they intersect at this vanishing point, which is rather conveniently almost in the center, which was a very common place for the choosing of a vanishing point. Of course, it's way in the distance. It's not right out here in front of us. Angelico had no problem using this newly developed technique of linear perspective, but his interest was in presenting this scene as simply as possible, a very medieval concept, as well as the symmetry involved, with one figure on this side, one figure here, rather balanced. And notice this very interesting curve here where the angel's wing just naturally curves right on up. It's very interesting. It's kind of a way that things are proportioned and balanced that fits neatly on the page, you might say, in a way that harks back to the symmetry and the arrangement of art of the Middle Ages. So some artists are using the new techniques, but not letting it dominate. Now others, on the other hand, Uccello, with this painting of the Battle of San Romano, this is an interesting example of artwork by a person who was absolutely fascinated with perspective. So much so that he really didn't pay much attention to other aspects of perspective that, if he had intended to use, might have given this scene a greater sense of depth. Here, he's done a lot of detail work in the same way that detail was expressed up here. That makes this illustration look flat. In the distance, things appear fuzzier. If they were drawn fuzzier, we would get the psychological cue that this is in the distance. The other thing about this is that he's done things here to artificially kind of force the use of a perspective. What he's done is to arrange these things here, which are broken lances. He's arranged them very conveniently so that they all point to a vanishing point. If you extend them, they're all going to point to someplace right about there, right about in the center of the screen. And of course, things don't fall this way. They don't naturally come about this way. So it looks a little forced, in addition to looking rather flat.